Photojournalism is a vehicle for telling compelling stories using photographs. It's been described as the photography of ideas. Philip Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post, once famously observed that journalism is the rough draft of history. Photojournalism is a visual rough draft of history. It's a way of providing a visual record of the turbulent times in which we live, and creates a document about the failures and the achievements of the society in which we live. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at a set of photographs from the fighting in Beirut between 1982 and 1985. And we're going to try and understand what is it that makes for a set of photographs that delivers a message of passion and compassion which drives a photojournalistic story. This is a set of pictures that I've chosen from a body of work that I shot in Beirut between 1982 and 1985. That was a period that spanned the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the subsequent war of the camps between the various Palestinian factions that were fighting for political supremacy in the country at the time. Conflict is a complex kind of story, and what I want to explore with these photographs is the kind of emotional backdrop that a conflict lends to the lives of the people caught up in that conflict. This is the essence of photojournalism. Photojournalism is about giving a voice to people who have no voice. And the classic canvas for painting that kind of picture is a conflict zone in which people are caught up in something not of their making. And these are some of the people who you will see in these photographs. Inevitably, the people who suffer most in a conflict zone are the young children who really bear no responsibility for any of the tragedy that swept up and carried their lives away. This photograph illustrates the impact that constant war has on residents of a neighborhood. These are people who are slowly going out of their minds with anger and frustration over the constant shelling, the constant bombing, the constant shooting around apartment houses in an urban setting. This is the center of Beirut. And these are people who have nowhere to go, no way to flee any of the danger that they face on a daily basis. This photograph is essentially an environmental portrait of this young girl. The concept of an environmental portrait is something we will cover in a later lesson. But this frame was basically constructed to get across something very specific about the life that this little girl is living. She's standing in a wedding dress waiting for her family to come out of their home. They're on their way to a wedding. But looming in this huge presence behind her is an armored personnel carrier, which serves as a metaphor for the lurking presence of the army inside the refugee camp where she and her family lives. This photograph is another one of the basic building blocks of the photojournalism story. This is a moment that is entirely dependent on access. This is an Italian field hospital that has been set up in the Sabra refugee camp in West Beirut. And these are Italian doctors treating Palestinian children who have been injured inside the refugee camp. The ability to come away with this kind of photograph is entirely dependent on the people with whom you're working trusting you to portray them in a fair and accurate light, and to be able to work in an undisturbed way. In other words, they need to feel confident that your presence is not going to disturb or interrupt the way they work. This is an example of street photography, a type of photograph that we're going to be examining in more detail in a subsequent lesson on this course. These are Christian militiamen who have been tasked with guarding the entrance to the Israeli military headquarters in southern Lebanon. One of the ideas that I'm very interested in exploring in all the work that I do in conflict zones revolves around the notion of war being something that robs a child of its childhood. And this photograph is a classic example of that. This child is acting out something that he sees going on the streets around him every day. The gun he's using is a toy gun, but the Italian soldier driving by in the Jeep doesn't know that. And this child is playing a very, very dangerous game because he's risking an instinctive response on the Italian soldier's part, which is to wheel around and aim his weapon at him and shoot. But to me, it says something very disturbing about the quality of the childhood that he has growing up where he is, and what the effect of the conflict around him has on his development now, and more to the point, what kind of an effect it's going to have on him as he becomes an adult. This photograph was taken in the main hospital in West Beirut at the height of the shelling in the city in 1982. For me, the power of this photograph comes from its graphic simplicity. The minimalist composition is what gives this photograph its power. Now, this notion of composition is something that we will be discussing in a separate lesson later on in the course. An inescapable fact of life in conflict zones is the levels of despair to which many people are reduced. This is another classic example of the street photography approach to photojournalism. This is a completely unplanned for, unanticipated, unstructured moment that just presents itself when you're walking through the streets during the day. This is the kind of encounter that you have with reality in a conflict zone. An inevitable consequence of conflict anywhere is people on the move, people fleeing the war. This photograph is of a woman crossing the Awali River, which separates North Lebanon from southern Lebanon. She's fleeing the fighting in Beirut and trying to find safety in Sidon, in southern Lebanon. One of the things that photojournalism does particularly well is provide us with a window on the absurdity of the human condition. This photograph was taken inside the headquarters of one of the Palestinian militias in West Beirut at the height of the fighting in 1982. The man sitting behind the desk, having a conversation on the phone, is using a live hand grenade as a paperweight. This photograph is another example of how composition can be used to deliver a very powerful message about a very particular aspect of life in a conflict zone. In this case, despair. This man is standing at the edge of the ocean in Juni, a city north of Beirut. Juni is the big port city in Lebanon. This final image is another example of an environmental portrait. This man's identity is wrapped up in his patriotism, something that he's not afraid to display, despite all the insanity and the chaos that surrounds him in this conflict zone. The ability to observe what is going on around you and to see rather than simply look is the real challenge of photojournalism. In this assignment, I'd like you to wander around the streets and public spaces of the towns and cities in which you live and shoot a set of 10 photographs of people taking selfies with their mobile phones. You need to pay particular attention to a variety of situations in which people are taking these selfies. You want to give yourself a broad enough spread of situations, of people interacting with their friends, with each other. You want to make sure that your set of 10 photographs has variety and pace, variety in location and pace of emotion.